Yep. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Whatever this bike is, and however good it isn't really a Vstrom. The V-twin engine defined the Vstrom name. Yes, I'm a pedant. Don't get me wrong, I like parallel twins, and in time it may become a great successor to the Vstrom, but for now, to me, it's simply the new Suzuki DE800. So let's take a look at what makes this bike what it is. The new DE800 parallel twin is a bit late to the game really, so it needs to be better than the other options on offer. Is it better? Firstly, is it better than the previous Vstroms? And secondly, is it better than the Yamaha Tenere 700, Aprilia Tuareg, Honda Transalp, KTM 890 Adventure and others? There are some features that are a definite improvement. The 21-inch front and 18-inch rear spoked wheels are a real bonus for any off-road use, and all the bikes listed except the DL650 have this combination. It does improve off-road usability and is a welcome change. Another welcome change that does put the DE800 in a class of its own is that it has a removable rear subframe, so if the rear does ever suffer any damage, it can be replaced and not simply written off. Suspension is another area with major improvements over previous Vstroms, and a lot has been made of the fully adjustable long travel forks. This is one area where the DE800 does really well. Much better than the 650 Vstrom, which has decidedly budget suspension. In comparison, the Tenere 700 and Transalp both come with fairly basic non-adjustable suspension too, although they do get more travel, but they have both had criticism about it. The Tuareg 660, KTM 890 and the bigger DL1050DE all have comparable suspension, and the differences here are much smaller. All have very good fully adjustable suspension. One thing it's good to see is that the customary Vstrom seat is still there. Passenger comfort is stressed in the marketing material, and Suzuki have obviously thought about it a lot more than most manufacturers. On this, the Vstrom is a clear winner over all the competition. The electronics package of all the bikes is in some ways about personal taste. Some people will love the complex electronics of the Tuareg and the KTM. Others will prefer the simplicity of the Tenere 700 and 650 Vstrom. The DE800, Transalp and DL1050DE fall in the middle somewhere. They do use complex systems with more features than the Tenere and DL650, but they don't have the comprehensive electronics of the KTM and the Aprilia. Significantly, an up and down quick shifter with a slipper clutch is standard, and there are 3 rider modes that adjust the power delivery. Traction control is fully adjustable and can be turned off completely, and there are 3 ABS settings which will cover most riding situations, including a setting that frees the rear wheel off from the ABS system. The engine on the DE800 produces about 83 horsepower and 78 Nm of torque, which is an improvement over the DL650, which produces around 70 horsepower and 70 Nm of torque. Compared to the other motorcycles in this class, at 80 horsepower and 70 Nm of torque, the smaller Aprilia engine is also slightly down on power, although it does rev very freely. The Tenere 700 crossplane engine produces slightly less at 72 horsepower and 68 Nm, but has been described as one of the best engine designs of recent years. The new Honda Transalp does a little better at 90 horsepower and 75 Nm of torque, but these bikes are all fairly comparable on power. The KTM 890 Adventure pushes performance, producing 105 horsepower and 99 Nm of torque, so it is a step above the rest at the moment. The bigger DL1050 obviously does better here too, with more power at 108 horsepower and 100 Nm of torque, which is produced lower down in the rev range. It has much more bottom end grunt. Many of the other specs are very similar, and it will inevitably come down to personal taste and riding experience. I can't compare or quantify taste, but there is a comparison that few will look at, which will affect the riding experience. The basic chassis geometry affects every moment of every ride. The turn-in of every corner and the balance of the bike are intrinsically linked to the rake and trail of the chassis, the length of the wheelbase, and the overall weight. The steeper the rake and smaller the trail, the faster the bike will turn in and the more nimble it will be. The heavier the bike is, the slower it will move from side to side, so the weight transfer and subsequent steering is slower. Both of these things can add stability or make the motorcycle more nimble. A heavy bike with a longer rake and trail will hold its line much better, which is great for riding on the highways or in high winds, but a lighter bike with a steeper rake and trail will be more nimble, which will improve off-road performance and the ability to negotiate tight turns. A shorter wheelbase has a similar effect, with a longer motorcycle being less tractable but more stable than a shorter one. The Yamaha Tenere 700 has become the benchmark by which other bikes are judged for off-road performance, so we'll start with these figures. The rake and trail is 27 degrees and 105mm, and the wet weight is 204 kilos. With a wheelbase of 1595mm, it's stable and holds its line well in the road, but is nimble off-road, changes direction quickly, and is a good balanced chassis. The DE800 has a rake and trail of 28 degrees and 114mm, and a wet weight of 230 kilos, with a wheelbase of 1570mm. The slightly longer rake and trail will balance the slightly shorter chassis, so the bike should be stable but also flickable with good off-road manoeuvrability, but the weight is definitely going to hurt its performance off-road. The short answer here is that the DE800 is not going to ride as well off-road. It will likely have better road manners, but the weight will affect both steering and performance off-road. Comparing the Aprilia Tuareg, it has a rake and trail of 26.7 degrees and 113mm and a wet weight of 204 kilos, with a wheelbase of 1525mm. The shorter wheelbase is significant here, and the steep rake angle also increases manoeuvrability. Its low weight and fast steering help it off-road. It's a more aggressive riding experience than the DE800, and this can be a good and a bad thing depending on how steady your riding is. With the KTM 890 Adventure, this philosophy is taken even further. The rake and trail is 25.9 degrees and 107.8mm, and the wheelbase is 1509mm, with a wet weight of 216 kilos. The weight is carried low, which minimises its effect, and the aggressive steering geometry and short wheelbase make it an exciting ride. It's nimble on and off-road, with remarkable stability for such a flickable motorcycle, and its extra power will give you a more exciting ride than the DE800. The Honda Transalp has a rake and trail of 27 degrees and 111mm, with a wheelbase of 1560mm and a wet weight of 208 kilos. With almost identical geometry to the DE800, it should be comparable in steering and balance, but this will depend on the quality of the non-adjustable suspension. Where the DE800 loses again is that weight. Next we come to the bigger DL1050 DE Vstrom. With a rake of 27 degrees, but a longer trail of 126mm and a slightly longer wheelbase of 1595mm, it will feel slower to turn and lazier than the DE800. The wet weight of 252 kilos makes it a heavier bike too, which inevitably has consequences, so the DE800 will be better if you do any amount of off-roading. Our last comparison is with the good old DL650 Vstrom. The rake and trail is 26 degrees and 110mm, and the wheelbase is 1560mm, with a wet weight of 220 kilos. Although compromised by the shorter travel suspension and the 19-inch front wheel, the 650 Vstrom is remarkably nimble, with a steep steering angle and geometry very similar to the KTM 890 Adventure. Even the weight is comparable to the KTM, but it does carry its weight higher. In comparison to the DE800, the Vstrom 650 wins in some ways and loses in others, so the choice is likely to be in relation to your own style of riding. It is lighter, shorter, and has more aggressive steering, but off-road ability is compromised by the 19-inch front wheel and limited suspension travel compared to the DE800. So, in conclusion, the original question was simply, is it better? Now that's never an easy question and will depend on how you use it. It certainly looks the part. In comparison to the previous V-twin V-Stroms, it does sit comfortably between them. This will give it advantages. The power is more than enough for most people, and the better suspension will make it more capable off-road. However, the weight is up on the old 650, and the wheelbase of the 650 is shorter too, which gives the 650 better manoeuvrability. Why a parallel twin chassis would be longer than a V-twin chassis and the DE800 heavier than the DL650, I have no idea. They are questions for Suzuki to answer. In comparison to the competition, I think the V-Strom has sadly missed the mark, but that will depend on how you use your motorcycle. The lower power to weight ratio will mean more to some than others. The DE800 will make easy off-road riding very simple because the suspension is so much improved. This is where it is better than some of the other bikes mentioned. So, for people who ride mostly on the road with some light green laning or gravel roads, it will be a very easy bike to ride. Where it will come unstuck is when the terrain gets harder and more technical. This is where the extra weight will affect it most. It won't be as much of a handful off-road as the bigger V-Stroms though. Out of the box, for off-road use it will be a good bike because of the improved suspension, but it will never be as capable as the KTM Aprilia Tuareg or Yamaha Tenere 700 when the terrain gets more challenging. So if you only take on fairly simple off-road use and travel with friends who will help you pick it up on the trails, this might be a great choice for you. I can't help be a little disappointed though, because I will never understand why it's a bigger, heavier motorcycle than the V-twin DL650. Or any of its parallel twin competitors. So, the next question I come to is, could it be better? Would the DL650 with the suspension and wheels from the DE800 be a better bike for all of the things the DE800 is better at? I will leave that question for you to answer in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if this gave you some information that helps you quantify what the new Suzuki DE800 is all about. Enjoy the ride, everyone.